Morning, Bitcoiners. Sun's up, gray day, that's okay. I checked, Bitcoin's running, right? We're good. We can have a coffee and talk about all the news. Lots going on, as usual. No lack of amazing and funny things to talk about. One of the funniest things that I saw yesterday that gave me a chuckle, and it shows how much the world has changed. You know, I'm someone who's been studying Bitcoin professionally, being paid to study Bitcoin since 2013. It'll be my 10 years of studying Bitcoin and working with Bitcoin. I didn't really psychologically flip to being a full dedicate my life to Bitcoin until I actually quit my job in 2015. I quit my job to work in Bitcoin, but I still didn't understand how much reorientation of my life it was going to actually mean until I did it, right? It's a weird thing. It's like, oh, I'm going to get married. And it happened when I got married, right? So I'm going to get married. And then you don't really realize how much your life changes after marriage. And it did. In my case, absolutely. Like I had been with my wife for years before that. And then we got married. And it really was different. You know, I'm not going to get into why and how and all those things, but it was a change that I didn't expect. And the same thing happened when I quit my job and went to Bitcoin. That change happened in 2015. But I've been studying it for 10 years. And when I first started studying, so this just shows how much I've changed, right? And I think you'll say the same. So yesterday, a peer-reviewed from Harvard study came out about Bitcoin, right? Now, like I said, 10 years ago, I'd have been like, wow, Harvard thinks it's a big deal. There's people at Harvard also studying Bitcoin. Amazing. So I'm still curious. I go and check and I get in the article, hedging sanctions risk, cryptocurrency and central bank reserves. And it's actually like a glowing assessment of Bitcoin, right? Like, you know, the language they use, there's charts. I'll give you a sense of the abstract. Central banks may shift their international reserve holdings in order to protect themselves ex ante against the risk of financial sanctions by fiat reserve currency issuers. For example, from 2016 to 2021, countries facing a higher risk of US sanctions increased the gold share of their reserves more than countries facing a lower risk of US sanctions. The paper explores the potential for Bitcoin to serve as an alternative hedging asset. I describe a dynamic Bayesian cupola model to simulate the joint returns of Bitcoin and other reserve assets under a wide range of plausible sanctions probabilities. So I'm not going to keep going. I'm reading this and I'm like, what the, like, okay, Bayesian, da, da, da. But thankfully, there were Bitcoiners immediately in the comments, Brandon Quitlam, the guy who wrote the mushroom and Bitcoin story, and they bring in the meme, you know, the one with the IQs, the dumb person, maybe it's a good idea to get some, and then the Jedi guy at the end saying, maybe it's a good idea to have some, and then the IQ in the middle, you know, the old one like this, a Bayesian cupola formula. Isn't that the truth, right? Isn't that just a microcosm of how much the world has actually changed? 10 years ago, I'd have said, wow, Harvard, right? Now, I was literally annoyed as I read it about what a waste of psychological mental horsepower it was to say why Bitcoin is good. All of this language, and the man says nothing. His name is Matthew Ferranti, and he's Department of Economics, Harvard University, October 27, 2022. It's a brand new paper. I commend the fella. Go for, like, I'm not trying to say that Matthew is doing something that I'm so angry by that I would do something about it. But just reading it, I was saying, God, this is annoying, right? Just reading this person talk about Bitcoin in such complicated language when it's really a simple thing, right? It's really actually a simple thing, right? And seeing the IQ meme, which is just one of the best memes, right? It really is one of the best memes out there. And it always works with Bitcoin for some reason. So a bunch of people were in the not condemning, not criticizing Matthew, but just saying, yeah, don't read this. Just look at this meme. Maybe it's a good idea to get some smart people. Maybe it's a good idea to get some dumb people. Everyone in the middle, Bayesian cupola formula. So good, right? So good. So, you know, as far as other funny stuff, it doesn't end there. This SBF story just keeps on getting new dimensions, new angles. We're going to talk about it later in the show, but just to start, so now it looks like there's going to be a sex tape. It looks like there's going to be a sex tape, right, of SBF. I don't know who, but I guess it's getting released tomorrow, and they want them to pay, right? So the point is for them to pay for all the trouble they've caused. And so maybe this is going to come out. And they're saying it's going to be on an uncensorable web page, right? So it looks like we get absolutely another big media cycle with these guys, which can only be good, right? Can only be good. Please no, Justin says. Please no. Yeah, well, it's tough luck, buddy. You get to see them bang. Looks like. We'll see. Are you gonna watch? I mean, I'm not gonna be able to help just look it up, right? I'm gonna take a look. Deck says life reality show confirmed. The one time I actually want to get rugged, Justin says. Yeah, you want to get rugged. You hope it's not true, right? You hope they underdeliver on that one. I don't think they will. Now, maybe it's all the media on top of SBF writing all these glowing puff pieces and all these other things. So there's a few stories there where I'm saying, you know, there's a lot more going on in this guy's head. And this truth and beauty quote, right? Like, did you guys see this? So all these tweets, and then he puts truth and beauty out at one point yesterday, and people are just getting enraged at this guy, right? Like the tweets that he's coming out with are just making people angry and angrier. And Autism Capital did some research in the Twitter thread about what the truth and beauty comment meant. So it's just one of those, like, what happened, and then he started describing it. So this is just all that stuff again. And he says the phrase truth and beauty is a line made famous by the 19th century poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. And beauty is truth, truth, beauty. This is all ye know on earth and all you need to know. So the point is, you know, don't go looking, it's always meant, don't go looking for answers. There's enough there for you to know, which is sort of an amazing comment in a way, right? That he's not, I don't think he's saying, I'm not going to mind read him, but I didn't hear, don't look at all. I think he's saying the truth is right in front of you. It's just right there. You don't need to get a smoking gun, right? It's right there. You just have to see the actors on the stage and know what play is happening, right? And so there'll be all this analysis and all these things, but pretty interesting way that SBF is using this coded language, and I'm here for it. I'm going to keep paying attention to this stuff. So the other funny story that everyone is covering is Justin Trudeau, right? Did you see Justin Trudeau getting dressed down, right? He got a talking to from Xi, the president of China. And normally I would say, you know, so Xi came and criticized him, and then he took it, right? He's sitting there, yeah. But then he fires back, you know, Canadians want or always will have a conversation about things, because it turns out they were influencing Canadian elections, right? So China was deliberately influencing candidates, pushing money, pushing messages, all those things. And it's been going on for a while, as I understand. I saw it in my time in Canadian politics and could recognize it immediately. The reason I saw it is there was a huge effort when I was working for the Prime Minister about selling gas reserves out in the West Coast, as well as potash. And normally for some of these large reserves of certain resources in Canada, we don't sell them if it's, you know, there's like a national security concern when it comes to uranium and a few of the things that we have that not everyone has that we want to keep and don't want to share. And China was starting to make huge plays to buy some of this stuff, potash and natural gas in particular. They were going to build all kinds of infrastructure in order to get this out of the country. And those were big decisions that came to our administration when I was there. And we invented, I had nothing to do with it personally, right? So I was already on Bitcoin stuff and I was not really paying attention to any of this, but it's, you know, the mandate would come through and you'd see, and political messaging and fighting. And so they got, you know, China got what it wanted at the time. We put a timer on it, let's say, that would be the end, right? So we only let the potash and the LNG go through, and then we said no more because it's just too much stuff that China's getting involved in, and we won't allow it any longer. Those were the two exceptions. So we could see the influence already, right? We could see influence. It was much more rudimentary, and now it's become a lot more sophisticated. We're going to talk about it in a second because it's related to some of the media stories. But from what I saw right there, you know, Trudeau getting dressed down, then he has this sort of comeback, right? Which is, in Canada, we believe in open dialogue and blah, blah, blah. But of course, that contrasts with the whole trucker protest, right? So when Canadians hear Justin Trudeau stand up for democracy now, right, the only audience that's actually there and listens to this stuff is, folks who got turned into terrorists like myself. The normie people don't care whether or not he's been influenced by China, or they're not even paying attention. Like, it's not on the radar, right? Whether he's been influenced by China, whether he's actually into democracy or not, they'll sort of just buy whatever talking points are prescribed to them and go with it. But the people who are actually paying attention, so it's a larger and larger community. Justin Trudeau only won the prime ministership in Canada with 30-something% of the total vote, right? Because we have a parliamentary system and it's not two parties. So you can split the vote in several areas and still win, right? You can win a seat in our Congress, our parliament, with 30%. That's pretty typical, actually, right? You've got 3 to 4 parties running. If they're really divided in a certain area, if you get the right demographics, 30% will carry it. And in a weird way, Trudeau was able to carry the country with 30%. It's the lowest percentage ever attained by a winner of a national election in Canada. I think even when I was there working for the last prime minister, I think we did a 42% or something, and it was pretty low considering all that was going on. But he's in the low 30s now. And so, the mandate isn't really there, and he is the punchline to a lot of jokes in Canada. And so when he came out and said, oh, we're into freedom in Canada and open dialogue, of course, it just goes into everyone's ears. You declared martial law and took people's money because they were honking horns, right? Honk, honk, and it was finished. So, of course, it stands in contrast to what's going on. And when I saw it, right, it actually, we talk about fourth turning frame here a lot, the 80-year cycles. It actually shot me out of the fourth turning cycle and into the 500-year cycle, which we like to talk about. We talk a lot here about the 500-year cycle and the 80-year fourth turning cycle. The 500-year cycle goes back to the shared birthdays of the printing press and the Reformation and Martin Luther tapping the note on the wall of the church on October 31st, 1517. And so we've always been talking about simulation theory, the weird coincidence that Bitcoin was also begun on October 31st, in this case, 2008. But the point is, we had separation of church and state with the first iteration, right? And now we're talking about the separation of money and state in the 500-year cycle. So what it ended up looking like, right, reminds me of this sort of, what are the bases of these individual cultures and what's the sort of narrative, right? So where is this all headed? The first one here, we can see we've got being on the land, commodities, the weapons, right, were hard to come by. And if you didn't know this, at the beginning of feudalism, anyone could pick up a sword. Swords were sort of easier to come by. If you had a farm, you could also have a sword and weapons and all that stuff. But then it started to become specialized with the knights, right? The knights started to become professional soldiers, and the knights' equipment became a little more expensive, a little better. They had armor now. So it became an unfair fight between the farmers and the knights. And so knights would gather around farms to protect them. And so the building blocks, the units, were the actual farms themselves, or lordships, as they got bigger. The energy sources, of course, were just whatever was on the land, right? You got subsistence. So the currency was actually food, right? You work to feed yourself and your family and your lord, and then you get some food. The weapons came from the actual arrangement of being around these knights. And then you had the energy itself was just whatever was on the land. They could burn peat moss, they could burn wood if they had any, but there was a large deforestation in that time, because you just cut all the trees over time, and there'd be not much left on the farm and all that. And then, of course, media was controlled by the illiterate, by relying on the illiteracy of the population and the expensiveness of spreading the written word and the amount of investment required to create a reader and the books for that person to practice reading. So it was really just the churches that held it. And then they even put another language barrier, which was Latin, right? They didn't deal in the local languages. So don't forget, Martin Luther actually translated, with the printing press, the Bible into German, so that people could just read it and not have to learn Latin first. They got some friction out of the way. What ends up happening is the money is replaced with fiat money. The weapons are upgraded, but now actually lend to larger groups, right? Because they're a little bit cheaper, but if you buy them in huge bulks, thousands and millions of guns at a time, you can have a standing army. So this changes the power arrangement from lords to kings or presidents later. Now, electricity was invented in this area, but was very complicated, required a grid, required all kinds of infrastructure, people, moving parts, companies, policies, all those things. So the weapons were changed, the energy was changed, and then not just a printing press, but we were able to get antennas, which were also centralized because you need an antenna to broadcast, and everyone is reading off of the broadcast itself, right? So what we saw yesterday with this G20, G7, some people say now G140, right? Because all these people are sort of in disagreement, like with what Matthew Ferrenti said, the Harvard guy, that that sanctions from the previous dollar system are still pushing people away. They're afraid that they'll get the same result as Russia. Now there's an argument about this alternative currency getting created called BRICS, right? So that's the G140, they say. So it used to be G7, G20. There's all these other countries there now. None of them super happy about American, let's say, fiscal policy. And here's an example, or monetary policy mixed with fiscal policy, right? That they're at counter the counter force, right? That right now in America, our fiscal policy, right, which is help people spend money on gas, give them stimmy gas checks to offset the cost of living and inflation. Meanwhile, you've got monetary policy, which is trying to keep inflation down. So you've got one force pushing inflation up, one force pushing it down, and it's confusion all around as a result. So other countries like Korea, right, at this G20, G140, whatever was going on yesterday, went and said to Americans, look, we're having a ton of trouble now because we can't keep up with the Fed rates, right? Our monetary policy is getting shredded because it's caught in the wake of the US monetary policy. So there's people arguing there right away. It's a little bit like what happened in Europe when you, not as much as a vice grip globally, but a similar situation that happened in Europe when Greece was defaulting and having trouble meeting its obligations. But the suppressed euro was actually great for Germany, right? So Germany at the time, 10 years ago, had a benefit of exports. Everything that was going wrong in Greece was really good for Germany to send things out. So it caused more of this sort of confusion and tension. Now, those things are creating a lot of this instability now, right? Korea not that down with what America's doing. They've already been a currency manipulator in the past. I learned a lot about foreign exchange when I lived in Korea. I lived in Korea for about 3 years of my life, and I've been many, many times. And what struck me already was how intuitive it was for everyone to arbitrage their money in America, the Korean won, and to work against exchange rate fluctuations, because they would know from policy measures that monetary policy in Korea was going to change, and therefore they were going to keep suppressing the won, the dollar would go up. So everyone would just sort of talk, you'd be out with people having a beer, and in America we would never talk about arbitrage of money, in the 2000s. But the Koreans would, right? They would always talk about it. And that was the first time I ever had any exposure to it. And this is pre-Bitcoin. This is all before Bitcoin. But I saw it happening. I saw how people did it. It still didn't mean too much to me, but just that it was so common. And then when currency manipulation became a real subject, I knew what was going on because I'd seen it, right? So, but here's what we see in the news today about this change, right? This 500-year cycle. So as I mentioned, the money changed, the weapons changed. That's what ended up basically disintegrating this feudal system, right? It was the printing press, energy, and weapons all changed, right? Energy, weapons, all that stuff changed into this. But here's what's going on today, right? Let's look at weapons first of all, right? This is a drone if you can't tell, right? So yesterday, a bunch of news came out with all these meetings about what Taiwan is trying to do about drones and the Chinese situation, and lots of activity, right? So first of all, you've got the Turkish drone maker, Haluk. I can't remember the name of the company, but this is one of these big Turkish companies. And here's a quote from them, right? This is in Nikkei Asia, because in Asia, it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue to cover the drones and what's happening between China and Taiwan. So here's what the Turkish fella said. It is now out of the question to have a war without drones. And those who do not harness the power of drones will be on the losing side of future conflicts. Now, he's a drone maker, right? So obviously he's in the bag. But here's more. This is from Business Insider from just a few weeks ago. China has gone mad for drones and is using them to keep the pressure on Taiwan's remote military outposts. So that was a headline in September from Christopher Woolley in Business Insider. You've got Financial Times here from a few weeks ago. Our military, this is how Taiwan is starting to respond to that, right? Our military is still relatively backward in their use of drones, said Chen Po-hung, a policy analyst at the Institute for National Defense and Security. Taiwan is attempting to build a military drone domestic supply chain within a year of Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen's efforts to bolster defenses against an increasingly belligerent China. And here's a national interest story from 3 days ago, November 10th, or sorry, 1 week ago, November 10th, 2022. Report, Taiwan investing 1.6 billion in drone manufacturing, right? And here's another quote from a senior official in Tsai's administration. Our military has so far failed to present a clear concept for the use of unmanned aerial vehicles in warfighting and to capitalize on our private sector's significant capabilities in the field. So they're trying to coordinate, they're trying to figure out how to do it domestically. But here's the really amazing stuff that has come out as a result of all of this, right? Here's one from JTech, right? They just tested a Flying Fish 200 kamikaze drone with GPS and artificial intelligence. It costs less than $3,000 for one of these vehicles, right? Here's another one. This is from a Chinese government official talking about a new drone weapon that they've created. China displayed the LW-30 laser weapon against drones at the air show in China. This can shoot down and target a drone for just $2. For $2, right? For $2, you can have one of these things. And so in the end, they're all over now in Ukraine. They're part of all the missions. As I predicted here on this show a year ago, that drones were going to completely change the logic of violence, the edge of violence, what's happening, right? The video game people are taking over here. And right away, you can see it goes from swords to guns. Now, the guns favored industrial manufacturing, armies. People needed to be trained to use them. They're quite heavy. You need ammo all the time, all these things, right? So when they first started, you had a reason to incorporate national standing armies to take these guns and do stuff, right? Of course, American revolutionaries, when the American Revolutionary War happened, were in a much better position because they were benefiting, as I understand, from a Dutch gun innovation that happened in Pennsylvania, where the Dutch guns were longer, and they had started to figure out how to, put guidance into the barrel to keep bullets straight. I guess they put sort of a metallic ribbon or some of just the shaping of the barrel and the bullet itself in order to get more accuracy. It was, I guess, a huge invention, and it was a major advantage for Americans as well. They had already learned from Native Americans on fighting styles, especially guerrilla warfare. So with these large guns that had more accuracy and a longer range than the British, plus they didn't have the rules of fighting in war as the British had established them, which were two armies, just come shoot each other till one army is finished. The Americans were shooting from the forest. They didn't care. They would shoot, generals first, right? Anyone who was on a horseback and as a leader and an officer, he was done. These were all rule breaking, right? It was kind of seen as impolite, right? It was impolite, but who cared, right? So right away we see drones are becoming the most important thing in military and are cheap, easy to make, and are going to proliferate. And I continue to predict you're going to have warlords, right? People who can take on national armies with these fleets of drones, drone swarms, and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's taken off the scale of national armies as the most powerful force. Because as I said, we are going to see in the next few years, you're going to see a beautiful US aircraft carrier with all those billion-dollar F-35s on the deck. And it's going to melt into the ocean. It's just going to melt. It's going to go, all of them, all off the deck. Ding, ding, ding. The whole boat's going to sink, right? The very symbol of World War II in the ocean, finished. And you won't even know who did it, right? So I think that's coming soon, right? A year or two. And it's going to shock people, but the drones are taking over, right? But it's part of this 500-year cycle now, right? So this was smaller units, feudalism, little places where you could be a king or a lord or whatever, and then it turned into nation states where you had national standing armies. And other than the United States, there are no armed citizens other than Switzerland or whatever. There's a few exceptions. But the United States is the only country with mass gun rights for individuals, right? Otherwise, it's all national armies and police states and things like that. So with weapons changing, right, from in scale, right, weapons changing the scale of participants in World War III, we have a situation where it goes from feudalism to nationalism and now to personal, right? Feudal, national, personal. The scale changes, right? So you can have warlords, you can have people operating at a much tighter, smaller scale that can now have influence in the world. So I think you're going to see it, especially in China. I think the situation we see in Taiwan, in China, and whatever else is going on there, right? We know they've got major demographic problems. We know they've got major economic problems, that the trajectory of their next few years is now no longer tied to economic growth as it has always been. You know, on this show, we've been tracking Xi's unique position in understanding probably that the census in China has been a lie for years and that the economic growth figures have also been a lie. So it's nowhere near poised to overtake America in terms of economic growth. It's not actually the second biggest economy in the world, or if it is, it's, you know, very nearly not, right? It's much closer to number 3 than it was earlier in people's, than it is in people's perceptions today, and much further from number 1 as it is in people's perceptions today. So now we don't know for sure, right? But from what we've checked on this show, research, peer-reviewed research from the University of Chicago, that shows that lumen hours, nighttime skies are a better indicator than GDP growth, especially when you're trying to measure GDP growth in a totalitarian economy that doesn't report accurate numbers. So according to just lumen hours, night light as judged by satellites, the Chinese economy is 60% smaller than it is now. We're not here to argue that it is actually 60% smaller than they've stated that it is. It's just what the analysis of nightlight does. Now, it could be totally different and I could be wrong, but my guess remains that it's not nearly as high as they said it is, and it's quite a bit lower. And I do think the population is lower than they said it is. Once again, no proof, other than some rumors, some indication, and some outside analysis that suggests so, right? And just own observation. But things get better for us, right? Things get better for us. This whole SBF story and everything that's going on has done a major service, right? A major service where the printing press here created a frame to get information to people. At first, broadcast technology did the same, right? But what we're seeing now more and more is this broadcast technology is not about individual enfranchisement or empowerment. It's about narrative control. Right, narrative control. And the SBF story is one of the greatest breaks in narrative control that people could ever have enjoyed. And Bitcoiners have a front row seat to it, right? We're seeing this more clearly than anyone, because it turns out that SBF had nothing in common with Bitcoiners at all, right? At all. And everything that he says now and everything that we hear the media say about him is driving more and more people who were maybe unclear about the New York Times' role in global politics, or maybe unclear on NBC's role in global politics are starting to see the contrast, and it's driving more and more people towards Bitcoin. And there's a million ways to prove this, right? So we've got Elon Musk coming out and saying that the coverage of the FTX meltdown is incomparably faster and better quality on Twitter than in old school media, right? So that's what he said yesterday. And here's what it looks like, right? You go from the book, then you go to this antenna that's still centralized, right? You can own this antenna, you can decide what's being broadcast because it's all the same information being read by everyone around it. It's even the same model in order to even just understand how the internet works today, right? The internet is really just a client-server model, right? So whoever the server is, all clients are seeing the exact same copy, right? It's one copy of the ledger, right? There's just one centralized copy of what's on the internet. And all you're getting is the mirror of that from every single other, from every single centralized server. So you get the server, you're a client, you read it, and everyone's reading the same thing. So this antenna works for both the internet as we've known it until now, as well as mainstream media. They're oriented and built almost identically. Of course, what we understand now in Bitcoin is that these decentralized networks with no center point of failure are a much better way of both distributing information and having confidence that the information is accurate, because as we all know, in Bitcoin, not having any central ledger is one of the main things we do to protect the decentralized nature of the ledger, thereby protecting the sanctity of the information and the cohesiveness of the information on the ledger is why we're here, right? One of the reasons why we're here. And it's a totally different information system, but it becomes obvious to us when we see stories like this. And it becomes even more obvious when we think about, here's, Barry Weiss, who we love. We are some of the biggest Barry Weiss fans going, right? Barry Weiss, I think, is going to continue to add great things to humanity. I put her on that level in some ways because she was one of the first people to defect from that New York Times world. She comes with a lot of credibility because of that, as far as I can tell. Now, I don't want to put too much confidence in her because even here, she's sort of missing the point. She's now on to the TikTok story, right? So she's got her focus on the TikTok story, starting to talk about the TikTok story. And she retweeted a Common Sense News story, how China got our kids hooked on digital fentanyl. I love the digital fentanyl line, by the way, because that's what it is, right? It's as dangerous as fentanyl, but it's digital. I don't know if you guys heard, but Christopher Wray, the FBI director, said 2 days ago, and this is where this stuff is starting to come to light. Christopher Wray, CIA director, anyway, it was either the FBI or the CIA. One of these people came out and said, "We're very concerned about TikTok." No, you're not. No. Very concerned is like, I'm very concerned that I don't have my winter tires on today and it snowed out and I have trouble. I got to get my winter tires on before I take a drive. I'm very concerned about the snow on the road, right? This is not that, right? Barry Weiss misses it a little bit here, right? Here's the quote from the piece. Over the past year, I've spoken with 24 former TikTok employees, mostly in Los Angeles, the location of the company's main office. They would only speak anonymously. Here's the quote. "The Chinese execs, they're in control," one former marketing person said. So they, in that article, chart the growth of TikTok and what's going on. But again, they focus on the dumb angle, the stupid angle, the data privacy angle. Who cares? That's data privacy is the same as the snowstorm out there, right? And my winter tires. It doesn't matter. It's dumb. It's a side story. The problem is the brainwashing. Who cares? Who cares about the data privacy? People trade their private data all day long to all kinds of companies. You want to see it stop, right? You don't want to empower the companies or the countries to that extent, but that's not the problem. The problem with TikTok is they can make you see anything they want. They can take things away and put things in. Do we hear about the actual fentanyl on TikTok? Are there stories about how fentanyl is killing more people than any war America's ever been in? Is that story on fentanyl? No, it's people dancing and complaining about politics. And that can be turned on and off. President Trump understood the danger, right? He tried to ban it. He understood it had nothing to do with data privacy. Do you remember that President Trump tried to ban TikTok in the last presidential election? Because this is a person who understands persuasion. He knows what's going on, right? That's his skill, right? His skill is hypnotizing people, making them think what he thinks, pushing his thoughts on them. That's his skill, right? That's what he does. Whether you like his techniques or not, and they're crazy, right? It's gets you angry, gets you inflamed, but he gets your attention, that's for sure. So he understood the power of TikTok. Do you think Christopher Wray understands the power of TikTok? I think they believe it's the stupid data thing, data management. It's not data management, it's brainwashing, right? It's brainwashing. So it's very powerful. So Barry Weiss misses the mark a little. They get into it a bit in the article. You've got a, there's a couple of quotes here, but anyway, nothing too relevant for what we're talking about. Nothing. They're still sort of around the issue, right? It's been used, in some political discourse. We've seen attention, right? But it's not nearly enough. If they were really concerned, it would be shut down yesterday, right? If the concern level was appropriate to the capacity of the weapon, it would have been shut down yesterday. If they would have known, like Trump did, how powerful it is, right? But at least Barry Weiss is on the case, it looks like, and I think she's the right person to keep digging here. And the digital fentanyl connection is exactly what we need to talk about going forward, right? But what it will do, again, is talk more about this broadcast media frame, right? Where, because the thing is centralized, because it can be used to direct your attention and to blind you from things, it's the same formula, right? It's not one of these data sources where it's stronger because there is no central point of failure and we can have confidence in it because whatever is being broadcast out is been consensus supported, right? So major difference. And yeah, there you go. So let me get my last stories here. Now, this is another piece on where things are headed about this personal and this track, right? And it comes from Michael Shellenberger again. So Shellenberger, we follow very closely on this show because Michael Shellenberger has done several things really important in America. And like Barry Weiss, I think he's going to have a large role to play as we continue this 500-year transition that we're in. And Michael Shellenberger wrote all about the FTX scandal and SBF and what's going on. So Shellenberger has been responsible, I would argue, for changed perceptions of American energy policy. I think he's responsible for changed perceptions in the open-air drug markets, right? So he's the first one to say that, and this is his whole point about it, is that thing they used in Europe to just give drugs in open-air markets, even Europe understood it was wrong, Amsterdam and all these places. We're still on that. We're still on open-air markets in the middle of towns, make the drugs available, and we'll pick up the problems later, right? So what he says is, no, you keep the drugs. This is a mental health problem. You get them out of the cities, you get them safe drugs, you do your best to fix the problem, but don't count on it, right? Best is to get them in a place where they can be healthy, usually farming on farms. That's what he's noticed is one of the best therapeutic forms of breaking addiction to some of these drugs, is getting them in a healthy rural environment, and eventually it does break. Not in all cases, right? He doesn't make a promise that there is one solution, but he understands that keeping cities safe and clean is super important, and will help limit the problem, because having it the way it is, which is just a big party in San Francisco, there's a bunch of people on the street, and why not more, right? Why not more, right? Why not, if you're into drugs, just go and it's happening, right? It's a scene, the energy is there, the drug energy is there, go get it. What he basically says is move the drug energy elsewhere, don't make it so appealing, and you won't have such a big problem. And the city of San Francisco has actually followed his directions, right? They've actually followed, he wrote a book called San Francisco, they followed these directions. His other book on nuclear energy, Apocalypse Never, right, also changed perceptions. These are two of the biggest files in America, right? Drugs and urban planning, I guess, that goes along with the drug problem, as well as nuclear energy. So he's right on top of both of these issues, and he comes in and starts talking about SBF here. And the way he frames it all is by going into some of his mother's teachings, right? His mother was a professor, a law professor, and she wrote a lot about how we don't have free will and how you shouldn't even judge people who make these mistakes, because basically we're all products of the society around us. And because we don't have free will, we shouldn't have personal responsibility, is more or less what he's arguing, she's saying in essays that she's written, which I haven't read. So I'm only going on his perception of her essays. So the one part, well, I will disagree with him, is on the free will. I'm not a big, I'm not convinced that we have free will. I'm not convinced. Because of things like TikTok. It's very easy to program people, very easy to get them to think things and push them in a direction, right? And so he takes a personal responsibility angle, which I do want to focus on, right? Because his part about free will in the article, but his part about personal responsibility, I think is where his argument is strong here. And he talks about that missing, right? Basically, in the world that SBF's mother created, there is no personal responsibility. There isn't, right? There is none. You're not responsible for your actions. And it looks like SBF's whole reaction to this is lack of personal responsibility. He still hasn't taken responsibility. He's, it sucks, you know, I sleep fine. That's where we're at, right? We still haven't seen remorse. We haven't seen regret. We haven't seen any of those things. And not that I'm saying I need to see them. I don't give a shit, right? I'm not a victim of FTX in any way. And I'm not, you know, I continue to think it's a really good thing, right? That FTX, that this happened to Bitcoin because of things like this, right? When you see this personal responsibility thing with the media sucking his butt and blowing sunshine up his ass to make sure he doesn't look bad, right? We get Vox again yesterday running another puff piece on him, where he actually even comes out and says ESG is bullshit, which is good, right? So that's the energy argument, right? We're already seeing from this that even SBF says ESG is done. So ESG's got to be done. It's just got to be. It's got to become the biggest joke. And I think SBF has to be the punchline of the joke, right? He's got to be the punchline of the joke. One of them anyway. Trudeau can be one of the punchlines as well, I'd say. But so Shellenberger goes into all this stuff about personal responsibility, and you know, he says right here, 24 tweets and still no responsibility. And that's really the trajectory that we're in here, right? That's the trajectory we're in here. We go from 500 years ago, where lords, knights are responsible for the safety of those feudal farms, lordships, areas, right? We move to national security time, right? Where guns, standing armies, and infrastructure, telecommunications, media, and energy become the building blocks, and those are the main features and what people are responsible for. Here's the 500-year shift, right? It goes from feudal to national to personal, right? With the confusion around BRICS and money and which is it BRICS or bucks, right? It's Bitcoin, right? In the personal responsibility world, it's not BRICS, it's not bucks, it's Bitcoin. The tools of war, totally altering, right? Totally altering. We see in Taiwan now, cheap, effective drones. They can do the job, right? Energy policy changing. And then the most important thing that the SBF story is teaching us, right? It's where we get our media, how we consume our media. As I said, I'd say this show has been on top of the SBF story from the very beginning, right? We sort of knew this sort of thing was coming. We've been providing the right frames, I think, to navigate it. It's complicated, but not really at the same time, right? This really is just an event that is singling the importance of personal responsibility. And as we mentioned on the show yesterday, Trezor sales are up. Everyone's starting to think about self-custody. There's a whole blueprint now for the industry to go forward. And people are getting on board. This is one of the great mass personal responsibility persuasion events that has ever happened in Bitcoin, right? You have this many people opening their eyes to the failures of centralized entities, third-party control, of all these systems. And it just looks like another one of these systems that's suffering, and especially with the media's response. The media's response has orange-pilled more people than anything I can think of, right? And we're starting to see that people understand the centralized nature of information distribution is a big problem. So what do we got for comments here? Justin says, deflation is war machinery used to offset the inflationary pressures being forced on other sectors like healthcare and education, just like Jeff Booth talks about. Yeah, absolutely, right? The deflation piece, I mean, you know, where my mind is at often right now is thinking about how much of this was going on, like how much of this confusion, like what we're experiencing here, right? Looking at the outside world, was going on during World War II, and whether people saw it the same way, right? That America had a bunch of problems and war would solve them. I'm not sure, right? Dex says, thanks for keeping me company while I work every morning. Yeah, no problem, Dex. That's what we're here for, man. We're here for better Bitcoin news every morning that won't leave you stressed out and worried about the future, because the future is bright, guys. We're going to win. We're going to win. We're on our way every day, closer and closer, right? Closer and closer. All right, team. That's all I got for today. I had a few other stories, but I can blend them into tomorrow. Oh yeah. I'll just mention that before we go, just about personal responsibility and what's going on. So here's the thing. You've got Bitcoin users, right? We're 300 million users today, and it's 4% of the world. And at current growth rates, in 3 years, we'll be at a billion. A billion. It's a country. Right? We're close to a country as it is. A country built on completely different foundations, and not a nation state by any stretch of the imagination, but a place, an empire of the mind, as we've discussed on the show before. And I think that's all we need to win, right? I think that's all we need to win. So plus a couple nuclear reactors, we're going to get those. My time frame for the nuclear reactor purchase is now no longer as short term as I thought this year. I thought Genesis was going to be one of the big financiers of the first nuclear mine, and I'd been, you know, working that angle for a while, but I don't think it's going to happen. Got to get someone else. All right, team. Peace.